In the summer of 2017, in the parched throat of the Oakhaven Valley, a man named Arlo Finch made a choice. He turned off a brand new $47,250 variable rate submersible irrigation pump, a machine his neighbors considered salvation, and opened a rusty gate for 110 Embden Geese. It was made with the quiet certainty of a man who had been watching water for 78 years. This is the story of how a flock of geese in a depression in the earth accomplished what a quarter-ton of precision-engineered steel could not. It is the story of a pond that was never supposed to exist and the 80 acres of pasture it saved. Let me tell you about the valley, because the land is where the story begins. The Oakhaven Valley isn't a grand sweeping expanse. It's a shallow basin, 12 miles long and 4 miles wide, carved by a creek that had mostly forgotten its purpose. By 2014, the Oakhaven Creek was a seasonal rumor, a damp shadow in the clay for 10 months of the year. The Finch farm, 120 acres of it, sat on the valley's western slope. Arlo Finch was 78 years old in the spring of 2015. He had worked this land for 62 of those years, taking over from his father, Elias, who had taken it from his father, Samuel, who had bought the parcel for $8 an acre in 1919. Arlo was known for a particular kind of stillness. He would stand at the edge of a field for 20 minutes, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. He wasn't idle, he was listening. He listened to the wind to know when the rain was a lie. He listened to the soil under his boots to know its thirst. He listened to the silence of his neighbors to know their fear. And in the years between 2014 and 2016, the silence was growing louder. The drought was not a sudden event. It was a slow tightening, a thief that stole a fraction of an inch of rain each year for a decade. The water table, which had been a reliable 40 feet below the surface when Arlo was a boy, was now gasping for air at 95 feet. The cost of electricity to run the old centrifugal pumps was becoming a line item of pure dread on every farmer's balance sheet. The town of Oakhaven, population 812, felt the tightening, too. The feed store offered credit, then shortened its terms. The diner saw fewer farmers for the 6 a.m. coffee. Young people who had once seen a future in the land now saw only risk. Into this quiet desperation came Marcus Thorne. He was 34 years old, irrigation consultant for Agri-Solutions, a company based 200 miles away in the state capital. He had a degree in agricultural engineering from a university that prided itself on data-driven optimization. He was handsome, confident, and he carried a leather-bound tablet that held the answer to the valley's prayers. He was not a villain. He was a man who genuinely believed in the power of his systems. His knowledge was real, but it was 2 inches deep and a mile wide. He held a meeting in the Oakhaven Community Hall on a Tuesday night in April. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee. 50 farmers sat on metal folding chairs, their faces illuminated by the glow of Marcus's projector screen. He showed them charts, graphs with upward-trending curves of efficiency and downward-trending curves of cost. He spoke of flow rates, pressure compensation, and kilowatt hours per acre-foot of water. The centerpiece of his presentation was the HydroFlow 7500 V-Rate, a submersible pump. That was, he explained, a revolution. "This isn't your granddaddy's pump," he said, smiling a practiced, reassuring smile. It delivers exactly the pressure you need. No more, no less. We're talking a baseline 22% reduction in energy costs. For a typical 100-acre operation, that's a savings of over $4,000 a year. A murmur went through the room. $4,000 was not a number to be ignored. And that's before we talk about water, Marcus continued, clicking to a new slide. The precision of this system reduces evaporative loss by an estimated 15%. That's water that goes into your soil, not into the air. With the federal drought resilience grant covering 40% of the installation cost, your return on investment is just under 7 years. He had their attention. He had their hope. He was offering them certainty in a world that had become terrifyingly uncertain. He was selling a steel and silicon solution to a biological problem, and the farmers, tired and scared. Arlo Finch sat in the back row, his hands resting on his knees. He hadn't said a word. He just watched. He watched the numbers on the screen, and he watched the faces of his neighbors. He saw them leaning forward, their minds already calculating, already spending the money they didn't have on a promise delivered by a man who had never walked their land in a dry August. It rested on a small oak desk in Arlo's study, the same desk his father and grandfather had used. It was a thick, cloth-bound book, its cover worn smooth by the hands of 3 generations. The spine was cracked, held together by yellowed tape. Inside, in elegant fading script, Samuel Finch had begun recording the life of the farm in 1920. He recorded rainfall to the 100th of an inch, measured in a simple tin can gauge. He logged the price per bushel of corn, the tonnage of hay from the south pasture, the birth weight of every calf. When Elias took over, the script became a more practical, blocky print, but the data continued. Elias added soil temperature readings and notes on the behavior of the creek. His own handwriting was a spare, careful scrawl. For 96 years, the Finch family had been collecting data, not on a server, not in the cloud, but on crisp, acid-free paper in waterproof ink. It was a dataset of immense value, a long conversation with a single piece of land. Arlo knew, because the ledger told him that the valley had seen droughts worse than this one. There was a 7-year dry spell in the 1,930 seconds that was far more severe. There was another in the late 1,950 seconds the farm had survived. It had survived not with bigger pumps, but with different practices. His grandfather had kept a flock of sheep to graze the pasture down, reducing the plant's demand for water. His father had practiced fallow field rotation, letting a third of the land rest and recover each year. They had treated water not as a resource to be extracted, but as a partner to be coaxed. After Marcus Thorne's presentation, as the other farmers crowded around him to sign up for consultations, Arlo quietly walked to the front. Marcus saw him coming, an old man in worn denim and a faded plaid shirt. He smiled, ready for another convert. "Mr. Finch, wasn't it? Can I get you some information on the hydro flow?" Arlo didn't look at the glossy brochure Marcus offered. He looked at the young man's hands. They were clean, the nails perfectly manicured. He said, his voice low and raspy, "I have a question about your data." "Of course," Marcus said, pleased to engage on his home turf. "Ask away. You said this pump will work reliably down to a water table of 150 feet. That's correct." The 7.5 horsepower motor has more than enough lift. It's rated for 200 feet, actually. We build in a margin of safety. And what happens at 151 feet? Marcus' smile tightened slightly. Well, at that point, you'd start to see a drop in pressure. But the projections from the State Hydrology Office show the aquifer is unlikely to drop below 140 feet, even in a worst-case scenario. Your projections are based on the last 10 years of data, Arlo stated. It wasn't a question. The last 15, actually. It's the most relevant date-gen. Marcus replied, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. Arlo was silent for a moment. He thought of the ledger at home. He thought of the entry from August 1934 in his grandfather's hand. Creek dry since May. Well at 162 feet. Pulled water by bucket for the house stock. Lost 4 cattle, God willing. Rain comes soon. My data goes back 96 years, Arlo said. It tells me the water can go deeper. It tells me a machine that fails at 151 feet is a very expensive anchor. Marcus's professional patience was wearing thin. He saw a stubborn old man, resistant to progress, clinging to a nostalgic past. He had dealt with this type before. Mr. Finch, he said, his voice adopting a tone of gentle condescension. With all due respect, you can't irrigate 80 acres with nostalgia. We're in a new era. We have to adapt with modern technology. The hydroflow is an investment in certainty. Arlo looked at Marcus Thorne, at his confident face and his expensive shoes, and he saw the profound fragility of the modern world. He saw a man who had mistaken a short-term trend for a permanent law of nature. Certainty, Arlo said, his voice barely a whisper. There's no such thing. There's only resilience. He turned and walked out of the hall, leaving Marcus Thorne surrounded by his more forward-thinking neighbors. Arlo's grandson, Ben, had been waiting by the door. Ben was 20 years old, home from his first 2 years at the State Agricultural College. He loved his grandfather, but he was a child of his time. He understood spreadsheets and soil chemistry. He was embarrassed by his grandfather's public skepticism. "Grandpa, what was that?" Ben asked as they walked to Arlo's old Ford truck. "That guy is trying to help us. Everyone else is signing up." Arlo didn't answer right away. He opened the creaking truck door, the sound a familiar complaint. He settled into the driver's seat, the vinyl cracked and molded to the shape of his body. He looked at his grandson. He saw the same impatience he remembered in his own father, and the same certainty he had just seen in Marcus Thorne. A man who sells you a solution you have to buy from him every year isn't selling you a solution, Arlo said. He's selling you a subscription. The land already has a solution. We just stopped listening to it. The next week, the Agri-Solutions truck arrived at the Miller farm, then the Jensen farm. All around the valley, the sounds of drilling and installation broke the morning quiet. The old, noisy pumps were pulled from the earth and replaced by the silent, efficient hum of the Hydroflow 7500. Arlo's neighbors were investing in the future. Arlo Finch drove his Ford F-150, a 1998 model with 247,000 miles on the odometer. In the opposite direction, he went to the regional livestock auction in Clay Creek 40 miles east. He didn't go to the cattle pens. He went to the poultry section, a chaotic, noisy corner of the auction yard filled with chickens, ducks, and turkeys. He found a breeder from up north who specialized in Embden geese. They were large, handsome white birds known for being hardy and good foragers. He bought 110 of them. The total cost was $1,650. He paid in cash. When Ben saw the flock of geese waddling and honking in the small holding pen Arlo had built, he was baffled. Geese? What are we going to do with one? Geese. We're going to build a pond, Arlo said. Ben looked out at the south pasture. 80 acres of dry, thirsty land. In the lowest part of the pasture, there was a shallow depression, a place where water used to gather in the spring before evaporating by June. It was a dusty hollow, maybe half an acre in size. "You're going to dig a pond?" Ben asked. "We'd need a bulldozer. We'd need to buy a liner. It would cost a fortune." He walked to the old barn and came back with a spade. The handle was dark and smooth from decades of use. It had been his father's. "The geese will build the pond," Arlo said. "We just have to show them where. Let me tell you about water and geese. A goose is not an engineer, but a flock of geese is a force of nature." For the next 2 years, Arlo Finch and his grandson and the 110 geese engaged in a slow, patient act of creation. The work began not with digging, but with guiding. Arlo used his father's spade to carve a shallow, almost imperceptible channel, no more than 6 inches wide, from a seasonal runoff gully that trickled down from the hills during the rare winter rains. He just suggested a new path for it, toward the dusty depression in the south pasture. The first rain came in November. It wasn't much, just 1/4 of an inch, but it was enough. A thin stream of muddy water followed Arlo's channel and settled in the hollow, forming a puddle no bigger than a pickup truck. It was a pathetic sight, a smear of moisture on a vast dry landscape. Ben looked at it, felt a fresh wave of despair for his grandfather's sanity. Then Arlo opened the gate. The geese, which had been foraging in the upper pasture, saw the water. With a chorus of excited honks, they half ran, half flew to the puddle. They waded in it, drank from it, bathed in it. For the rest of the day, they stayed in and around that small puddle. And this is where the magic began. It wasn't magic, of course. It was biology and physics working on a geological timescale. The process is called puddling. The soil in the Oakhaven Valley was a silty loam, a mix of clay, silt, and sand. Water soaked right through it. But when it was wet and agitated, the fine clay particles suspended in the water and then settled, forming a dense, layered, and remarkably waterproof seal. Each of their 2 webbed feet had a surface area of roughly 12 square inches. Every step they took in the mud concentrated their weight, compacting the soil beneath them. 110 geese, taking thousands of steps a day in the same small, wet area. They were a living compaction machine. Their constant paddling and stomping churned the silty water, allowing the finest particles of clay to settle and create an impermeable layer. And there was more. The geese ate. They foraged on the tough grasses and weeds around the growing puddle, and what they ate, they processed. Their droppings, rich in nitrogen and organic matter, fell directly into the water. First, the organic matter helped to bind the soil particles, further sealing the basin. Second, It acted as a potent fertilizer. By the spring of 2016, the puddle had survived the winter. The water was a murky green, rich with algae that bloomed in the nutrient-dense environment. That layer of algae, in turn, helped to seal the pond floor and reduced evaporation by shading the water from the sun. He stopped seeing a crazy old man and a flock of birds. He started to see a system. He read his great-grandfather's ledger, and then his grandfather's. He started his own notebook. He measured the pond's circumference every Sunday. In April, it was 220 feet. By June, after another small rain, it was 310 feet. The water was holding. While his neighbors' fields were getting their precisely calibrated doses of water from 100 feet below the ground, delivered by the silent, expensive pumps, Arlo's pond was slowly, patiently gathering water from the sky and the surrounding land. The cost of the project was minimal. The geese cost $1,650. Their feed was supplemented with a few $100s of grain in the driest months, but mostly they foraged for themselves. Arlo and Ben spent their own labor a few hours each week, widening the channels, guiding the water. There were no electricity bills. There were no maintenance contracts. The neighbors watched, at first with pity, then with a kind of grudging curiosity. They called it Finch's Folly. They saw the geese. They saw the muddy patch of water, and they shook their heads. They would see Arlo sitting on the tailgate of his truck, just watching the pond, and they assumed the old man had finally lost his grip. Arlo and Marcus Thorne crossed paths at the feed store one day. "Heard you've got yourself a new irrigation system, Arlo," Marcus said, a smirk playing on his lips. "The geese are doing fine," Arlo replied, not taking the bait. "You know it's not too late to get a hydroflow installed before the summer heat really kicks in," Marcus offered. "The grant money is still available." "I'm not worried about the summer," Arlo said. "I'm getting ready for the next one." The summer of 2016 was as dry as predicted. The hydroflow pumps worked flawlessly. The farmers who had them saved money on electricity, just as Marcus had promised. Their fields looked green. The system was a success. Finch's Folly, meanwhile, had expanded to just over an acre. It was 4 feet deep at its center. It was holding its own against the relentless sun, but it wasn't irrigating anything. It was just there. A strange green oasis in a brown landscape. The turning point came not with a flood, but with a trickle. The winter of 2016 to 2017 brought average rainfall. The parched land soaked up most of it, but the runoff channels flowed for weeks instead of days. Arlo and Ben carved another feeder channel, and then another. They weren't building a reservoir. They were building a web, a vascular system that gathered the land's meager offerings and delivered them to a single beating heart. By March of 2017, the pond was almost 3 acres in size and nearly 10 feet deep in the middle. It held an estimated 4 million gallons of water. For the first time, Arlo opened a sluice gate. He and Ben had built at the pond's lowest edge. A gentle, steady stream of water flowed out, following a shallow ditch along the contour of the land, into the 80-acre south pasture. It was a slow, patient kind of irrigation. Gravity-fed, silent, free. The water didn't spray into the air. It seeped into the ground. The pasture, which had been a pale, dusty green, began to deepen in color. The soil, which had been hard and cracked, softened. That summer, the summer of 2017, the valley's luck began to run out. It was hotter and drier than the year before. The drought wasn't just continuing, it was deepening. The water table, which had stabilized around 110 feet, began to drop again, 120 feet, but they had to work harder. They ran for more hours. The promised 22% energy savings evaporated as the motors strained to lift water from ever-increasing depths. Then, in late July, the Miller farms, well, the one closest to the creek bed dropped to 152 feet. The pump, with its safety margin, was rated for 200 feet, but not at the flow rate needed for irrigation. The pressure dropped. The sprinklers at the far end of the field sputtered and died. A week later, the same thing happened at the Jensen place. Marcus Thorne's certainty had a fatal flaw. It was based on an assumption that the past 15 years of data represented the worst-case scenario. The ledger book on Arlo Finch's desk knew better. The Oakhaven Valley Water Board called an emergency meeting in the first week of August. The same community hall, the same metal folding chairs. But the mood was different. The hope was gone, replaced by a familiar. Marcus Thorne was there. He looked tired. His confident smile was gone. He stood at the front of the room, not with a presentation, but with an apology. "The aquifer is dropping faster than any model predicted," he said, his voice strained. "We, the state hydrologists, we are recommending mandatory water rationing for all agricultural users, effective immediately." A wave of groans and angry muttering filled the room. Rationing in August meant losing a significant portion of their crops. It meant financial ruin for some. One farmer stood up. "I paid $50,000 for your pump. You told me it was the solution." "It's the most efficient system available," Marcus retorted, his voice defensive. "It can't create water that isn't there." The argument grew heated. Accusations were thrown. The meeting devolved into a mess of anger and despair. Arlo Finch sat in the back. As always, he hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. Beside him, Ben sat straight and tall. He was 22 now. He had spent 2 years watching the geese. Gray. He had spent 2 years measuring the water. He had spent 2 years learning the difference between a system that extracts and a system that collects. The chairman of the water board finally managed to restore a semblance of order. "Are there any other comments before we vote on the rationing proposal?" The room was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner. Then, Ben Finch stood up. Every head in the room turned to look at him. They were surprised. Ben was known as a quiet kid, respectful, someone who kept to himself. He held a small spiral-bound notebook in his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and steady. It carried across the room. He didn't address Marcus Thorne. He addressed the chair. "My name is Ben Finch. My family farms 120 acres on the west slope." He paused and took a breath. "We won't be needing our water allotment this year. We'd like to give it to whoever needs it most." A stunned silence fell over the room. Giving away your water allotment in the worst drought in a generation was insanity. The chairman looked confused. "Ben, I don't understand." "How are you irrigating?" "We have a pond," Ben said simply. It's gravity feeding our south 80 acres. We haven't turned on our well pump in 18 months. Marcus Thorne, who had been slumped against the wall, stood up straight. His face was a mask of disbelief. A pond, that muddy hole. It can't possibly hold enough water to irrigate 80 acres. Ben didn't argue. He just stated facts. He opened his notebook. As of this morning, the pond covers 4.2 acres. Its average depth is 11 feet. It's holding approximately 12 million gallons of water. Our soil moisture in the south pasture is at 65%. The grass is healthy. The cattle are fine. He looked up from his notebook and met Marcus Thorne's gaze. The geese are fine too. The climax of the story was not a shout. It was a number. 65%. In a valley where most soil moisture was hovering around a critical 30%, that number was an impossibility. It was a miracle. No one said anything for a long time. The farmers didn't look at Marcus Thorne anymore. They turned in their metal chairs, a collective scraping sound filling the hall, and they looked at the old man in the back row. They looked at Arlo Finch. He hadn't said a word, but his silence was now the loudest thing in the room. He simply met their gazes one by one and gave a slow, deliberate nod. In that moment, they understood. They had bought a machine. Arlo Finch had built a system. They had invested in efficiency. Their solution was 150 feet underground, getting harder to reach every day. His was right there on the surface of the earth, shimmering in the August heat, held in place by the patient, tireless work of 110 geese. The rationing plan was passed, but the mood of the valley had shifted. The anger at Marcus Thorne dissipated, replaced by a dawning, difficult realization. The next day, 3 farmers drove down the long gravel lane to the Finch farm. They didn't ask for water. They just wanted to see the pond. They stood at its edge, watching the white geese glide across the green water. They looked at the lush pasture beyond it. They asked Arlo questions. Not about pumps or flow rates, but about clay and runoff, and the habits of birds. Arlo answered them, his voice quiet, sharing knowledge that was 96 years old. Within a year, 2 other farmers had started their own small ponds, using Arlo's methods. They were smaller, less effective at first, but they were a start. They were a turning away from the single fragile solution in the ground and a turning toward a slower, more complex solution on the land. Marcus Thorne left AgriSolutions 6 months later. The rumor was he went back to the university, not to teach, but to study. He was pursuing a doctorate in integrated water resource management. He was looking for a different kind of answer. Arlo Finch lived for 4 more years. He spent most of his afternoons sitting on the tailgate of his old truck, parked on the rise overlooking the pond. He watched the geese. He watched the water. He watched Ben, who now managed the farm, take measurements and make notes in a new ledger of his own. The pond, once called Finch's Folly, was now known throughout the county as Finch's Lake. It had become a permanent feature of the landscape, a landmark, a testament. It attracted ducks and herons. Its edges grew thick with cattails. It was a living thing. The story of the Oakhaven Valley is not that a complex problem has a simple solution. It's that the most resilient solution is often not a product you can buy. A machine designed for maximum efficiency is brittle. It performs perfectly within its narrow parameters, and then fails completely when they are exceeded. A biological system is messy, inefficient, and slow. It performs imperfectly all the time, which is precisely why it does not fail when conditions are at their worst. The farmers of Oakhaven didn't need a better pump. They needed a better memory. They had forgotten what Arlo's grandfather had written in the ledger, in the depths of another great drought. The land will care for you if you care for the land. It remembers the rain even when you forget. What survives is not what is strongest or what is most clever. What survives is what holds water.